Tonight, we begin high above the sleeping world. Beyond the last dark ridges of the mountains, where the air grew thin and the clouds drifted below the peaks, stood the shining home of the Greek gods. The ancient poets called it Olympus. By daylight, its halls were bright with the clear light of the sun. By night, the stars seemed to gather close around its terraces. The earth lay far beneath, quiet and distant, while the sea moved like dark silver along the edges of the world. From this high place, one family watched over almost everything that existed. At its center was Zeus, ruler of the open sky. The rain that crossed the fields belonged to him. So did the thunder that rolled over the hills and the bright flash that briefly turned night into day. To the people below, Zeus was the king who protected order, guarded promises and decided when the balance of the world had begun to shift. Beside him stood Hera, queen of Olympus. Hera watched over marriage, family, and the bonds that held one generation to the next. She carried herself with the calm dignity of someone who knew her place beside the throne. Yet the palace she ruled was not always peaceful. The family of the gods was filled with old wounds, hidden rivalries, and promises that were not always kept. Far from Olympus, Poseidon ruled the sea. His kingdom reached beyond every visible shore. He knew the silent valleys beneath the water, the deep currents that crossed the world and the sudden storms that could rise beneath a clear sky. Sailors spoke his name before leaving harbor. They hoped that the Lord of the Sea would allow their ships to pass safely over his restless domain. And beneath the earth, beyond the reach of sunlight, Hades ruled the land of the dead. His kingdom was not a place of flames or endless punishment, as it would often become in much later stories. It was a quiet and shadowed realm where every mortal journey eventually ended. Hades kept its gates, its laws, and its ancient order. He rarely climbed to Olympus, but he remained part of the same powerful family. Zeus above, Poseidon across the waters, Hades below, and Hera beside the throne that held the family together. These were not distant strangers who happened to share the world. They were brothers and sister, born to the same parents, shaped by the same fear and freed by the same rebellion. Two other sisters completed the older generation. Demeter watched over the growing earth and the grain that rose from it. Hestia guarded the quiet flame at the center of the home. Their stories mattered deeply, but it was Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades whose choices would repeatedly change the path of gods and mortals alike. They had inherited a world already scarred by conflict. Their father had feared them before they were old enough to speak. Their mother had been forced to hide one child in order to save them all. Before Olympus became a palace, it had been the prize at the end of a war between generations. And after that war was won, the brothers and sisters divided existence between them. The sky went to Zeus. The sea went to Poseidon. The shadowed world below went to Hades. The earth remained beneath them all, shared, contested and filled with mortal lives. For a time, it may have seemed that the great struggle was over. The old rulers had fallen. A new family sat above the world. The age of Olympus had begun. But winning the world and ruling it wisely were not the same thing. The decisions made within this family would shape the seasons. Their arguments would cross the seas as storms. Their children would become gods, heroes, and wanderers. Their loyalties would help bring armies to the walls of Troy. And long after the war was over, one last traveler would still be trying to find his way home through a world the gods had made. So tonight, we will not try to remember every name in Greek mythology. We will follow only a few familiar figures. We will remain close to Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades, returning to them as the generations rise and the legends unfold. Through their family, the many scattered myths begin to look less like separate tales and more like one long story. A story of parents and children, of power inherited and power feared, of a family that divided the world and then spent ages living with the consequences. And to understand how they came to rule from Olympus, we must leave the shining palace behind. We must travel backward, into an older and darker age, when Zeus had no throne, Poseidon had no sea, and Hades had not yet seen the kingdom beneath the earth. Before we travel into that older age, it helps to look once more at the world the siblings eventually created. Olympus was not merely a home in the clouds. It was the center of a new order. From there, Zeus listened to disputes between gods and mortals. He guarded the customs of guests and hosts, and he watched over the promises made beneath the open sky. When kings claimed authority, they often believed some part of it had been granted by him. Yet Zeus was also restless. He had fought for freedom and did not easily accept limits, even when those limits were meant to protect the peace of his own household. This would become one of the deepest contradictions in the world of the gods. Zeus valued order, but his own choices often disturbed it. Hera understood this better than anyone. She was not simply a figure standing behind the king. She had authority of her own, and the ancient world honored her in great temples. She represented the dignity of marriage and the lasting structure of family. But she was married to a husband whose actions repeatedly wounded both. This made Hera powerful, proud, and often unforgiving. The anger that grew inside the royal marriage would not remain in Olympus. It would reach the children of Zeus, the women he loved, and the mortals who happened to become part of the family's conflicts. Poseidon was different from them both. He did not spend all his days in the high palace. His true home was the sea, where light faded into blue and then into darkness. He could be generous to sailors who respected him, but he could also remember an insult for years. A single offense against Poseidon might follow a traveler from one end of the world to the other. Where Zeus ruled from above, Poseidon surrounded the mortal world. Every island rose from his waters. Every journey between distant lands crossed his domain. Even the ground itself was said to tremble when his anger moved through it. Hades ruled a realm that no living traveler wished to enter. Unlike Zeus and Poseidon, he received little of the glory of the visible world. There were no bright storms or shining waves in his kingdom. Yet his work was essential. Someone had to keep the boundary between the living and the dead. Someone had to ensure that even kings and heroes eventually followed the same ancient road. Hades was stern, but he was not usually careless. He had fewer stories of wild adventures than his brothers. His greatest decision would be the choice of a queen, and that choice would pull the sunlit earth and the shadowed underworld into one of the most important agreements in mythology. Around these four figures, the later stories would gather. A daughter of Zeus would rise as the calm mind of Olympus. A son of Zeus would suffer beneath Hera's anger and become the greatest of mortal heroes. A warrior at Troy would discover that even extraordinary strength could not protect him from loss. And after Troy had fallen, a clever king would learn how long Poseidon could remember a wound to his pride. Yet none of these later lives can be understood without the fear that came before them. The family of Olympus did not begin in safety. It began with a ruler who heard that one of his own children would take his place. That ruler was Cronus, the father of Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, and Hestia. Long before the marble halls of Olympus, Cronus ruled during the age of the Titans. The world was younger then. Mountains seemed closer to the sky. Forests stretched across lands with no roads, and the boundaries between earth, sea, and heaven had not yet settled into the order known by mortals. Cronus himself had once risen against an older ruler. He knew what it meant for a son to challenge a father. He knew how quickly a throne could pass from one generation to the next. And because he understood rebellion, he began to see it everywhere. The prophecy that reached him was simple. One of his children would overthrow him. Cronus might have responded with patience. He might have accepted that no rain lasts forever. He might have raised his children with trust and allowed the future to unfold. Instead, fear became the center of his rule. The moment each child was born, Cronus took the infant away. One by one, the future rulers of the world disappeared into the darkness of their father's body, held there without sunlight, without freedom, and without any chance to grow. Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Their mother, Rhea, watched each child vanish. And when she understood that her sixth child would meet the same fate, grief finally became courage. For the first time, she decided that Cronus would not be allowed to see what had truly been born. Rhea left the halls of Cronus quietly. She traveled across the young world to a distant island, a place of high mountains, hidden caves, and valleys protected from the eyes of the ruler she feared. There, far from the throne of the Titans, she gave birth to her youngest son. She named him Zeus. For a brief time, the child rested in a world his brothers and sisters had never known. He heard the wind moving through mountain trees. He felt the warmth of daylight. He was carried into a hidden cave where those loyal to Rhea could keep him safe. Back at the palace, Rhea wrapped a stone in cloth. She carried it as though it were a newborn child and placed it before Cronus. The fearful ruler did not pause to look closely. Believing the final danger had been removed, he swallowed the bundle and returned to his throne. The prophecy, he believed, had been defeated. But in a cave far away, the future king of Olympus continued to grow. The childhood of Zeus survives in several different forms, as ancient stories often do. Some said he was fed by a gentle goat. Others said that protective spirits guarded the cave and filled the air with sound whenever the baby cried, so that Cronus would never hear him. The details changed from poet to poet. The heart of the story remained the same. Zeus lived because his mother chose to resist fear. As the years passed, he learned who he was and what had happened to the children born before him. He learned that he had brothers and sisters held inside the ruler of the world. He learned that his father's peace had been purchased by denying an entire generation its freedom. Eventually, Zeus left the safety of the island. He did not yet carry the thunderbolt. He did not yet sit above the clouds. He was simply the youngest son returning to a house that did not know he had survived. With help, Zeus approached Cronus and caused him to release what he had taken. First came the stone Rhea had placed in the cloth. Then, one after another, the hidden children returned to the light. Poseidon emerged into a world of air and open distance. Hades saw the living earth for the first time. Hera, Demeter, and Hestia stood together beneath a sky they had never known. They were fully grown in the strange language of myth, preserved through the long darkness inside their father. Yet freedom must still have felt like a second birth. Imagine their first moments together. 6 brothers and sisters looking at one another after years of separation, though most had never truly met. Zeus was the youngest, but he alone had grown beneath the sun. The others had shared the same prison, the same silence, and the same father's fear. This difference may help explain the family they later became. Zeus had been free, but alone. The others had been together, but confined. Hera had known what it meant for a father to treat his own children as threats. Poseidon had known a world without space or movement. Hades had spent his earliest existence in darkness long before he became the ruler of the dead. They had escaped Cronus, but escape did not mean safety. The ruler of the Titans still held the throne. Around him stood the powers of the older age. He would not quietly surrender the world to the children he had tried to erase. Zeus understood that the family had only two choices. They could hide and wait for Cronus to find them, or they could stand together and end his rule. The brothers and sisters chose to fight. The war that followed would not be a brief clash beneath one afternoon's sky. In the old stories, it lasted for years. Mountains shook. The earth echoed. The younger gods gathered on one side, while the older powers defended the age that had come before. At first, neither generation could gain a lasting victory. Zeus and his siblings possessed courage, but courage alone was not enough. They needed allies. They needed powers that Cronus had buried and forgotten. They needed weapons worthy of a war for the entire world. Deep beneath the earth were ancient beings imprisoned by the old rulers. Among them were master craftsmen with a single bright eye, figures later remembered as the makers of divine weapons. Zeus freed them. In gratitude, they prepared 3 gifts. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt. For Poseidon, they made the trident. For Hades, they made a dark helmet that allowed its wearer to pass unseen. The 3 brothers now carried the symbols that would follow them through every later age. The sky, the sea, and the unseen world had not yet been divided between them. But already, the shape of that future was beginning to appear. The sisters also had their place in the struggle. Hera stood with the younger generation, no longer the powerless child taken from her mother. Demeter, who would one day govern the growing earth, fought for a world in which new life could rise without being swallowed by the old. Hestia, quietest of them, represented the sacred center the family had never possessed. Together, the siblings prepared to challenge Cronus. The war between the generations became known as the War of the Titans. From the heights, Zeus released the first great thunder. The sound crossed valleys and struck the walls of the older age. Light flashed over the mountains. For the first time, Cronus may have understood that the child he believed destroyed had returned with the power to end his reign. Across the land, Poseidon raised the trident. The seas answered. Waves struck the shores, and the deep foundations of the world trembled. The brother who had once been unable to move now carried a weapon that could disturb the earth itself. Hades traveled unseen beneath the dark helmet. He passed where the older powers could not easily follow, moving between shadow and battle, reminding the Titans that even a ruler cannot defend himself against what he cannot see. The stories of this war are filled with enormous shapes and impossible forces. Cliffs were torn from mountains. Fire met water. The sky became so loud that the depths beneath the earth seemed to answer. Yet at the center of all this vastness was still a family conflict. A father who had feared his children. Children who refused to disappear. And a youngest son determined to prove that the future could not be held forever inside the past. Zeus also freed other ancient prisoners, beings of immense strength who had been hidden away because their power frightened the older rulers. With these allies beside them, the balance finally changed. The defenses of the Titans began to break. Cronus lost the throne he had protected through fear. The prophecy came true not simply because Zeus had been born, but because Cronus had created the very rebellion he wished to prevent. By treating his children as enemies, he had ensured that one day they would stand against him. When the war ended, silence returned slowly. The thunder faded beyond the mountains. The sea settled against the shore. Dust drifted down over a world that no longer belonged to the Titans. Zeus and his siblings had won. But victory left them with a question almost as difficult as war. What should they do with the world? They had fought together, but they were not identical. Zeus had led them, yet Poseidon and Hades had also carried weapons that helped decide the struggle. Hera had endured the same imprisonment as her brothers. Demeter and Hestia belonged to the same generation and had shared the same danger. No single throne could easily contain them all. So the brothers agreed to divide the great realms by chance. They drew lots. The sky fell to Zeus. The sea fell to Poseidon. The world beneath the earth fell to Hades. The land where mortals would live remained shared between them, beneath the influence of the whole divine family. Zeus rose to the heights and began to build the order of Olympus. Poseidon entered the ocean, carrying his trident into blue depths no sunlight could fully reach. Hades descended into the underworld, where the spirits of mortals would one day gather. It was a fair division in the simple sense that chance had decided it. But fairness is not always the same as happiness. Zeus received the brightest kingdom and the position of king. Poseidon received a realm vast enough to surround every continent, yet he would forever look upward and know that his younger brother ruled above him. Hades received a kingdom that was essential, immense and rich beneath the soil, but separated from sunlight and from the daily life of Olympus. Hera would become queen beside Zeus, yet the authority of her marriage would soon be tested by the very god who shared her throne. The siblings had defeated the fear of their father. Now they would have to face their own desires, their own rivalries and the old habits they had carried out of darkness. The age of Olympus had begun. And beneath its golden light, the first cracks were already forming. The new gods did not build Olympus all at once. The palace above the clouds grew with the new order, hall by hall and terrace by terrace, until the highest mountain seemed to hold a second world above the first. There were courts open to the sky, quiet chambers warmed by golden fire and long tables where the divine family could gather. At the center stood the throne of Zeus. He had been the hidden child, the returning son and the leader in war. Now he had to become something more difficult, a ruler in peace. Zeus wanted the world to possess laws. He watched over the promises exchanged between strangers. He expected guests to be treated with kindness and travelers to be given shelter. He listened when people called upon the gods as witnesses to an oath. A king might command a city, but even a king was expected to remember that justice stood above him. This was one side of Zeus. The other side was less settled. Freedom had defined his youth. He had survived because his mother refused to let Cronus control the future. Perhaps because of this, Zeus rarely accepted restrictions upon his own wishes. He could defend the order of the world in one moment and disturb the peace of his family in the next. Hera became queen beside him. Their marriage joined the authority of the sky with the dignity of the household. In temples across the Greek world, Hera was honored as a great goddess in her own right. She protected brides, watched over marriage and represented the continuity of families through time. On Olympus, however, the marriage of Zeus and Hera carried a difficult burden. Hera expected loyalty from the husband who ruled beside her. Zeus often followed his desires beyond the palace. Their disagreement became one of the repeating forces of mythology. Zeus would act. Hera would discover what had happened. Her anger would search for somewhere to settle. Because Zeus himself was difficult to challenge, the consequences often reached others around him. This pattern would shape the life of a famous son many years later. For now, the halls of Olympus were still new. The siblings gathered there and looked down upon the world they had won. Demeter watched green life return to the valleys after the violence of war. Hestia kept the central flame, creating the sense of home that none of them had known under Cronus. Poseidon visited from the sea. When he entered Olympus, the smell of salt seemed to follow him. His dark hair carried the memory of deep water, and the trident remained close at hand. He respected the victory the family had won together, but he did not always enjoy standing in a palace where Zeus was clearly king. Hades came less often. The underworld demanded constancy. Its gates could not be left unwatched, and the dead continued to arrive whether the gods above were celebrating or arguing. When Hades did climb to Olympus, he seemed to carry a deeper silence with him. The difference between the brothers was easy to see. Zeus looked outward from the highest point. Poseidon moved through a kingdom without fixed roads. Hades remained within a realm whose laws never changed. Hera observed all three and understood that the family's peace depended upon boundaries that the brothers might not always respect. For a while, the great division held. The sky remained above. The sea remained around the lands. The underworld remained below. Mortals began to build homes, tend fields, and raise cities beneath the eyes of the gods. Smoke rose from small altars. Sailors poured offerings into the sea. Families kept a flame for Hestia and called upon Hera during marriages. The gods were everywhere in the shape of daily life. Yet the world had not been divided into perfect, separate pieces. Rain from the sky entered the sea. Rivers crossed the earth before reaching Poseidon's waters. Seeds disappeared beneath the soil and later returned to Demeter's light. Every mortal life moved, sooner or later, toward the kingdom of Hades. The realms overlapped. And because they overlapped, the choices of one god could disturb the kingdom of another. This was especially true of Zeus, whose authority reached widely, and of Hera, whose concern for family made every new child and broken promise part of her world. The gods had escaped a father who tried to prevent the future. But they had not escaped the question that troubled every generation. What happens when the children begin to change the world their parents created? The answer would first appear in an extraordinary daughter of Zeus. But before Athena rose into the light of Olympus, another daughter would cross the boundary between sunlight and shadow. Her name was Persephone. And through her, the separate kingdoms of Demeter and Hades would become connected forever. Far below Olympus, Poseidon traveled through his own palace beneath the sea. The ancient imagination pictured it with walls that shone like shells and paths crossed by currents instead of wind. Strange lights moved through the blue distance. Great creatures passed beyond the columns, silent and powerful, while the sound of waves rolled faintly through the water above. Poseidon's kingdom was beautiful, but it was never still. The sea could carry a ship toward a new home or turn it back toward the shore. It could offer food, trade, and discovery, then hide the horizon behind a storm. This changing nature suited its ruler. Poseidon valued respect. A careful sailor remembered him. A city near the coast honored him. A traveler who crossed the water without gratitude risked drawing the attention of a god who did not easily forget. He also desired recognition equal to that of Zeus. In later stories, Poseidon would compete for cities, defend his pride and interfere in the journeys of mortals. he was not simply an angry god of storms. He was the brother who had helped win the world and who knew that chance, not weakness, had placed the sky in Zeus's hands. Hades faced a different life. His kingdom was steady where the sea was changeable. The underworld received everyone. The wealthy and the poor, the famous and forgotten, the ruler and the servant all reached its boundary in time. Hades did not cause every death, nor did he wander the earth searching for lives to end. He governed what came after. Beneath the soil were also the hidden riches of the earth. Metals rested in darkness before human hands brought them into the light. Seeds waited below the ground before they rose. In this sense, the realm of Hades was not only an ending. It was a place where unseen things were kept. Yet it was lonely. Zeus had Hera beside him. Poseidon moved through a world filled with living motion. Hades sat in a great and ordered kingdom without a queen. The loneliness of Hades would lead to one of the most famous stories in Greek mythology. But it is important to remember the family around that story. Persephone was not a stranger chosen from some distant world. She was the daughter of Demeter, sister of Zeus and Hades. This meant that when Hades desired Persephone, he was not only reaching toward the living earth. He was drawing the next generation into the unresolved relationships of the first. Above, Demeter cared for the land. She was close to the rhythm of mortal life. Grain rose beneath her influence. Orchards flowered. Fields changed from green to gold. People depended upon her gifts every day, often without seeing how fragile those gifts could be. Persephone moved through this sunlit world beside her mother. She belonged to the younger generation, born after the fear of Cronus and the War of the Titans. To Demeter, she represented continuity, proof that the children of the new gods could grow beneath an open sky. Hades saw her and wished for her to share his throne. Ancient versions differ in how much Persephone knew or chose before the moment that changed her life. The best-known story tells of the earth opening as she gathered flowers, and of Hades carrying her below in a dark chariot. We can imagine the scene gently. A meadow under a clear sky. The small movement of flowers in the wind. Then a deep sound beneath the ground. The earth opens, not with chaos, but like a hidden door. A chariot rises from shadow. Hades reaches the sunlit world for the bride he wishes to bring into his kingdom. Within moments, the meadow is empty again. Persephone has vanished. Demeter searches for her. At first, she believes her daughter may be nearby. She walks through the fields and calls her name. She crosses hills, follows rivers, and waits for an answer that does not come. Day becomes night. Night becomes another day. The goddess of the growing earth carries a torch through the darkness, looking for the child who has disappeared from the world. As Demeter's grief deepens, the land begins to change. The fields lose their color. Seeds remain still beneath the soil. Leaves dry on the branches. The absence of one daughter becomes the silence of the entire earth. This is the moment when the private conflict of the gods becomes part of nature itself. Hades has taken a queen. Demeter has lost a child. And Zeus, ruler of the family, can no longer remain above the problem and hope it will resolve itself. From Olympus, Zeus looked down upon a world that was beginning to fade. The people below could not live without the gifts of Demeter. If grain no longer grew and fruit no longer ripened, the altars of the gods would soon stand empty. Mortal voices would fall silent. The new order Zeus had fought to create would weaken from the ground upward. He sent word to Demeter. she would not return to her work while Persephone remained below. He sent word to Hades. The ruler of the underworld did not wish to surrender the queen who had brought life and companionship into his shadowed palace. The disagreement placed Zeus between two of his own siblings. This was one of the first great tests of his rule. A command might force one side to yield, but it would not heal the family. Hades had authority in his own realm. Demeter held a power the world could not survive without. Zeus needed an agreement that respected both. At last, a path was opened between the underworld and the earth. Persephone could return to her mother. Yet before she left, she ate a small number of pomegranate seeds in the kingdom below. In the language of myth, food created belonging. By eating what grew in Hades' realm, Persephone became connected to it. She could not remain forever in only one world. A compromise was made. For part of the year, Persephone would live above with Demeter. For part of the year, she would return below as queen beside Hades. When mother and daughter were reunited, the earth awakened. Green shoots rose through the soil. Trees flowered. Fields moved softly in the wind. When the time came for Persephone to descend again, Demeter's sorrow returned, and the land entered its quieter season. In this way, the ancient story explained the movement of the year. But it also revealed something about the family of Olympus. The gods did not merely command nature from a distance. Their relationships became nature. The grief of Demeter could empty the fields. The marriage of Hades and Persephone could create a road between life and death. The decision of Zeus could establish a cycle that every living person would experience. The world was no longer shaped only by thunder, sea, and stone. It was shaped by love, absence, compromise, and return. Persephone herself also changed. She was no longer only the daughter who gathered flowers in the sun. She became queen of the underworld, able to move between two realms that no other major figure crossed so regularly. Beside Hades, she brought a different presence into the land of the dead. The shadowed halls were still solemn, but they were no longer ruled by one lonely god. For Demeter, the arrangement was never a complete victory. Her daughter returned, but not forever. For Hades, it was not complete possession. His queen belonged partly to the world above. For Zeus, the compromise preserved the balance, but it could not undo the pain that had created it. This pattern would repeat throughout Greek mythology. The gods would act. Another god or mortal would suffer. Zeus would attempt to restore order. A new custom, season, punishment, or heroic journey would emerge from the solution. Olympus remained beautiful, but beauty did not mean peace. Within the royal palace, the marriage of Zeus and Hera was becoming another source of consequences. Zeus continued to seek love and companionship beyond his marriage. Some of these unions would produce children with extraordinary gifts. One daughter would become among the wisest of the gods. One mortal son would become the strongest of heroes. Hera saw these children as living reminders of broken promises. Her anger was not directed equally at Zeus, whose power protected him. Instead, it often followed the mothers and children connected to him. This made Hera one of the most misunderstood figures in later retellings. She could be harsh. She could pursue those who had little control over the circumstances of their birth. But beneath that harshness was the queen of marriage trapped within a marriage that repeatedly denied the very order she represented. To understand the next generation, we must keep both truths in view. Zeus wished to fill the world with life, possibility, and remarkable children. Hera wished to defend the dignity of the family and her place within it. neither desire remained private. Their conflict moved outward. It entered palaces and forests. It followed heroes from infancy into adulthood. And it ensured that the children of Olympus would inherit not only divine power, but also the unfinished struggles of their parents. Poseidon also carried his family's conflicts into the mortal world. He was honored in coastal cities where ships filled the harbors and horses crossed the open land. People depended upon his favor, but they also understood that the sea could never be controlled completely. In one famous contest, Poseidon and Athena both wished to become the protector of a growing city. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident and offered the force of the sea. Athena offered an olive tree, a quieter gift that promised food, oil, wood, and long years of cultivation. The people chose Athena's gift. The city would carry her name. Poseidon did not forget. The story expressed more than a simple competition. It showed two forms of power. Poseidon offered immediate force, the energy of water breaking through stone. Athena offered patience, planning, and something that would continue to grow. This difference would matter in the age of heroes. Poseidon often responded to disrespect with direct resistance. Athena preferred guidance, strategy, and time. Zeus watched both. Athena was his daughter, yet her birth carried him back toward the fear of Cronus. Before Athena was born, Zeus heard a warning that a future child might one day surpass him. It was the same kind of fear that had ruled his father and, before that, an even older generation. Zeus faced a choice. Would he trust the future he had fought to free? Or would he repeat the pattern he had condemned? For a time, fear won. He prevented Athena's mother from giving birth in the ordinary way, drawing her wisdom into himself. Yet prophecy could not be silenced so easily. Soon Zeus was struck by a great pain in his head. The pressure grew until the other gods gathered around him. At last, his head was opened, and Athena emerged fully grown, armed and shining. It was one of the strangest births in mythology. But within the larger family story, its meaning is clear. The next generation could not be hidden forever. Athena rose directly from the mind of Zeus, carrying intelligence, discipline, and the ability to see beyond immediate anger. She became the daughter closest to his authority, not because she simply obeyed him, but because she understood how order could be protected through thought rather than fear. Hera's feelings toward Athena were not the same as her feelings toward every child of Zeus. Athena had no ordinary mother standing outside the marriage, and she became an established part of Olympus. Still, her arrival changed the balance of the palace. The younger gods were beginning to take their places. We will not pause to name them all. That is where many journeys through Greek mythology become difficult to follow. A long line of divine children appears, each with a title, a symbol, and a separate collection of stories. For our journey, Athena is enough to represent the new generation of Olympus. Through her, we can see how the children inherited the strengths and fears of their parents. She carried the authority of Zeus, but not his restlessness. She could be proud like the older gods, but she usually preferred careful action. She would stand beside cities, craftsmen, and travelers. Most importantly for the story ahead, she would become a guide to heroes. The age of the gods was slowly opening into the age of mortals touched by divine power. Some heroes were children of gods. Others were protected by them. Others drew their anger and spent years trying to escape it. The world below Olympus became a place where an ordinary birth might hide an extraordinary future. A child could grow up without knowing that the conflicts of the gods already surrounded him. This was especially true of the most famous mortal son of Zeus. He would possess strength beyond other men. He would face creatures that seemed impossible to defeat. His name would travel farther than the kingdom in which he was born. But before he could become a hero, he would first become the target of Hera's deepest anger. The Greeks called him Hercules. Many later languages would remember him as Hercules. And in his life, the broken marriage at the center of Olympus would become a long human struggle for endurance, forgiveness, and peace. Hercules was born far below Olympus in the mortal world. He was the son of Zeus and a human mother. From his earliest days, the strength of the sky seemed to live within him. The old stories imagined that even as an infant he possessed a power no ordinary child could hold. But his birth also drew Hera's attention. To Hera, the child was another sign that Zeus had broken the promises of their marriage. Her anger followed Hercules before he was old enough to understand why. This is one reason his story belongs at the center of the Olympian family. Hercules did not choose the conflict between Zeus and Hera. He inherited it. As he grew, his strength became famous. He could bend weapons other men struggled to lift. He crossed wild country without fear and faced dangers that caused whole groups of warriors to turn back. Yet strength did not make his life simple. The gods had given him extraordinary power, but they had also placed him inside a family struggle older than he was. Hera sent hardship toward him. At times, that hardship came from enemies and impossible tasks. At other times, it reached into his own mind, bringing confusion and sorrow. In the most painful part of his story, Hercules lost control of himself and caused terrible harm within his own household. The ancient tale does not allow strength to protect him from regret. When clarity returned, Hercules understood that he could not undo what had happened. He went in search of a way to make amends and was told that he must serve a mortal king who feared and envied him. The king gave him a series of tasks. They became known as the labors of Hercules. There were 12 in the familiar tradition, but we do not need to count every creature, kingdom, and distant road tonight. It is enough to follow a few moments that reveal what the labors slowly taught him. His first great challenge took him into a quiet region troubled by a lion no weapon could easily pierce. Hercules entered the creature's cave. The passage was narrow and dark. Behind him lay the daylight. Before him waited the sound of breathing in the shadows. He could not rely upon an arrow or a spear. He had to meet the danger closely, using patience as well as strength. When he emerged, he wore the lion's hide as protection, and its shape became part of how later generations imagined him. Another labor brought him to a marsh where a many-headed serpent lived. Whenever one head was cut away, more seemed to rise in its place. This was not a challenge that strength alone could solve. Hercules needed help. He learned to work with a trusted companion, dealing with each danger carefully so that it could not return. The lesson was simple, but important. Even the strongest hero did not have to face every burden alone. In another story, Hercules traveled to the far edge of the world and briefly carried the weight of the sky. The image is immense, a mortal man standing where the earth seemed to end, holding the heavens above his shoulders. For a moment, the burden of the divine order rested upon someone born below Olympus. The labors led Hercules through forests, islands, mountains, and lands beyond the familiar world. He faced wild animals, guarded treasures, and crossed boundaries between the living and the dead. Again and again, Hera's anger placed difficulty before him. Again and again, Zeus remained a distant father whose power could not simply remove every consequence. This tension gave Hercules his lasting shape. If Zeus had protected him from all suffering, he would have been only a favored child. If Hera had destroyed him at the beginning, he would have become only a forgotten victim. Instead, he endured. The labors transformed his strength from something uncontrolled into something useful. He learned when to act directly and when to wait. He learned that power could open a path, but wisdom was needed to choose the right one. Athena sometimes appeared as a quiet guide in these stories. She did not complete the tasks for him. She helped him see what the task required. In this way, two children of Zeus stood in contrast. Athena represented measured thought. Hercules represented enormous force slowly brought under control. Both carried part of Zeus into the next generation. And both would help connect the family of Olympus to the age of heroes that followed. The later labors carried Hercules farther from ordinary life. He cleaned what seemed impossible to clean by changing the course of water itself. He brought a fierce animal back without killing it. He traveled beneath the earth and returned again, proving that even the boundary of Hades could be crossed when the gods allowed it. Each task became part of a long act of repayment. Hercules could not erase the sorrow behind his journey, but he could decide what kind of person would emerge from it. This made him different from the older gods. Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon often answered a wound with another act of power. Their anger could last for generations. Hercules slowly learned to carry pain without allowing it to define every future choice. He was still imperfect. He could be impatient, proud, and quick to act. Yet the shape of his story moved toward release rather than endless revenge. At the end of his mortal life, the old tradition said that Hercules was received among the gods. The long anger of Hera finally came to rest. The child she had pursued became part of the divine family, no longer an unwanted reminder moving through the mortal world. In some stories, reconciliation was made complete through a marriage within Olympus, joining Hercules peacefully to the household that had once rejected him. This ending matters. The family of the gods was capable of repeating old wounds, but it was not incapable of change. Cronus had tried to erase his children. Zeus had freed his siblings, yet still carried some of his father's fear. Hera had pursued the children born from Zeus's broken promises, yet her anger did not have to remain eternal. Hercules became proof that a conflict could end differently from the way it began. By the time his journeys were over, the world had entered the great age of heroes. Across Greece, stories gathered around exceptional men and women who stood somewhere between ordinary mortality and the distant power of Olympus. Some had a divine parent. Some were protected by a god. Some gained fame by surviving a god's anger. We will not follow them all. There were hunters, sailors, founders of cities and travelers who entered labyrinths or crossed unknown seas. Their names filled the songs of ancient poets, but a sleep story can lose its path when every new road brings another family tree. Instead, we remain with our anchors. Zeus still watched from above. Hera still guarded her dignity and remembered old injuries. Poseidon still surrounded the lands with uncertain water. Hades still kept the final boundary. Athena had begun to guide those who used thought as well as courage. Hercules had shown what happened when the conflicts of Olympus entered a single mortal life. The next great event would gather all these influences into one place. For years, the kingdoms of mortals had grown. Palaces stood above busy harbors. Ships crossed between islands. Families traced their ancestry back to gods and heroes, and rulers believed the favor of Olympus could decide the future of a city. The divine family also formed loyalties among these places. Athena favored cities that valued skill and strategy. Poseidon remembered the shores where he had been honored and the rulers who had failed to keep their word. Hera protected certain royal houses and carried anger toward others. Zeus tried to remain above smaller rivalries, but even he could not always prevent the gods from choosing sides. Across the sea stood Troy. Its walls rose strong and high above the plain. Traders entered its gates. Ships passed near its coast. To the people within, the city must have seemed permanent. Yet Troy already carried an old connection to Poseidon. In one tradition, Poseidon had helped build its famous walls and had not received the reward he was promised. The insult remained in divine memory long after the mortal ruler responsible had disappeared. This is how the world of Greek mythology worked. A broken promise could outlive the person who made it. A god could remember what a human family had forgotten. And generations later, an old wound might become one small force inside a much greater disaster. The immediate spark would come from a choice made at a celebration among the gods. A young Trojan prince would be asked to judge a contest he could not possibly resolve without creating enemies. He would choose the promise of love. The woman connected to that promise was Helen, whose beauty was famous across the Greek world. Her departure for Troy would bring kings, warriors, and ships toward the city's walls. But behind the mortal conflict stood the older family of Olympus. Hera had been insulted. Athena had been insulted. Poseidon carried an older grievance of his own. And Zeus would soon discover that ruling the gods did not mean he could keep them from entering the greatest human war of the age. The celebration that set the road to Troy in motion was meant to be joyful. Gods and immortals gathered for a marriage. Music filled the air, and the tables were prepared with food that never seemed to diminish. Yet one unwanted guest brought a golden object marked with a simple promise: it belonged to the most beautiful. Hera claimed it. Athena claimed it. The goddess of love claimed it as well. Zeus refused to choose between them. Perhaps he understood that no answer could preserve peace within the family. Instead, the decision was given to a mortal prince from Troy. His name was Paris. The three goddesses offered him different futures. Hera offered authority. Athena offered victory and wisdom in war. The goddess of love offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose the promise of love. The choice gave the golden prize to the goddess who had made that promise, but it left Hera and Athena deeply insulted. Once again, a private rivalry among the gods began to move outward into mortal lives. The woman Paris had been promised was Helen. She was already married to a Greek king. Ancient versions differ in how willingly she left, how much divine influence shaped her choice, and where responsibility should rest. What mattered to the larger story was that Helen crossed the sea to Troy, and the rulers of Greece treated her departure as a reason for war. Messengers traveled from kingdom to kingdom. Old promises were remembered. Ships were prepared. Warriors left their homes and gathered beside the sea. Among them was Achilles. Achilles was young, brilliant, and almost impossible to defeat in battle. His mother was a sea goddess, and through her he stood close to Poseidon's world, though he was not the son of Poseidon. His father was mortal, which meant that beneath all his extraordinary strength, Achilles still belonged to the short life of humankind. This knowledge shadowed him. The story said that Achilles faced a choice between two futures. He could remain away from Troy, live quietly and grow old, though his name would fade. Or he could sail to war, win everlasting fame, and die young. Achilles chose the road to Troy. This choice made him the clearest symbol of the heroic age, a man willing to exchange years of life for a name that would survive them. Another warrior joined the expedition for very different reasons. Odysseus was a king, a husband, and a father. He did not long for the war in the same way. His strength was not the nearly invincible force of Achilles. His gift was intelligence. Athena recognized something familiar in him. Odysseus watched, listened, and waited for the moment when a careful plan could achieve what direct power could not. The goddess of strategy became his protector, though even her help would not spare him from every consequence. The Greek ships crossed the sea. On the plain outside Troy, an army spread beneath the walls. Within the city stood Hector, eldest prince and greatest defender of his people. Hector was not fighting for distant fame. He was fighting for his home, his family, and the streets he had known since childhood. This made the meeting between Achilles and Hector more than a contest of strength. They represented two different forms of duty. Achilles had chosen glory. Hector had chosen responsibility. Around them, the gods began to take sides. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, still carrying the memory of Paris's judgment. Poseidon also aided the Greek side at important moments, his old grievance against Troy resting beneath the events of the war. Other gods protected the city. Zeus attempted to watch the balance, but his own loyalties and promises pulled him in more than one direction. The war lasted year after year. Summer dust rose beneath marching feet. Winter rain darkened the plain. Children inside Troy grew older, knowing only the presence of the enemy beyond the walls. The Greek warriors built lives of a kind beside their ships, waiting for a victory that always seemed near and never arrived. The famous conflict was not one uninterrupted battle. It was long periods of waiting, broken by sudden danger. And within that long uncertainty, the greatest threat to the Greek army would come not from the walls of Troy, but from a quarrel inside its own camp. Achilles would be dishonored by the commander of the expedition. His anger would remove him from the battle. And when the strongest warrior sat beside the sea, refusing to fight, the old family pattern appeared once again. Pride created division. Division created loss. And loss would draw the gods and heroes toward a moment none of them could reverse. Achilles withdrew to the edge of the camp. The sound of battle continued in the distance, but he no longer joined it. He sat near the sea where the waves moved steadily against the shore, carrying his anger toward the realm of his divine mother and the wider waters of Poseidon. Without Achilles, the Greek army weakened. Hector led the defenders of Troy across the plain. The Greeks were driven back toward their ships. Fires appeared near the shore, and for the first time, it seemed possible that the long expedition might end in defeat. The closest companion of Achilles could no longer watch. He asked to wear Achilles' armor and enter the battle in his place. The sight of the familiar armor, he hoped, would frighten the Trojans and give the Greeks time to recover. Achilles agreed, but warned him not to go too far. For a while, the plan succeeded. The defenders believed Achilles had returned. They pulled back from the ships. Hope moved again through the Greek camp. But the companion continued toward Troy. There, beneath the attention of gods and warriors, Hector met him in battle. When the fighting ended, the friend of Achilles lay still, and Hector carried away the famous armor. News reached Achilles beside the sea. His anger changed. The quarrel that had kept him from battle suddenly seemed small beside the loss of the person he loved most. Grief moved through him with greater force than wounded pride. Hera and Athena had wanted Achilles to return. Now no command was needed. New armor was prepared for him, shining with images of the world he was about to re-enter: cities at peace, cities at war, fields, stars, dancers, and the endless sea. Achilles placed it upon his shoulders and walked back toward the plain. The battle between Achilles and Hector became the emotional center of the war. Hector understood the danger. He also understood that Troy depended upon him. For a moment, fear made him move away from the warrior approaching across the field. Then he stopped. He turned and faced Achilles outside the walls of his home. The struggle ended with Hector's death. Achilles had avenged his companion, but revenge did not return the person he had lost. Victory left him with the same grief, now joined by the knowledge that another family would mourn. That knowledge reached him through the old king of Troy. Under the cover of night, the king entered the Greek camp and came before Achilles. He did not speak as a ruler addressing an enemy. He spoke as a father asking for the body of his son. Achilles looked at him and remembered his own father far away. For a quiet moment, the war disappeared. Two people sat together, joined by grief on opposite sides of the same conflict. Achilles returned Hector to his family and allowed time for mourning. This act did not end the war, but it revealed the change within him. The hero who had once chosen fame above all else could still recognize the pain of another household. The war continued after Hector's funeral. Achilles himself did not live to see its final end. The short, glorious future he had chosen was fulfilled. His name would last, but he would not sail home. Troy remained standing until intelligence succeeded where years of force had failed. Odysseus helped create a plan. The Greeks built a great wooden horse and left it outside the city while their ships appeared to sail away. A hidden group waited inside the hollow structure. The people of Troy brought the horse within the walls. During the night, the hidden warriors emerged. The Greek army returned from the darkness beyond the coast, and the gates were opened. After 10 years, Troy fell. The gods had chosen sides, protected favorites, and answered old insults. Mortals had fought, suffered, and carried out the final acts. The heroic age reached its terrible height in the burning city. Yet even after the walls had fallen, the influence of Olympus continued. Some Greek leaders reached home quickly. Others faced storms, shipwreck, and long years of wandering. For Odysseus, the war had taken 10 years. His journey home would take 10 more. Athena would remain near him as a guide. But Poseidon would stand between the traveler and the island he longed to see. The clever king had survived the war of men. Now he would have to cross the anger of the sea. Odysseus left the ruins of Troy with home in his thoughts. Across the sea lay his island kingdom, a place of rocky shores, olive trees, and familiar hills. His wife waited there. So did the son who had been only an infant when the ships first sailed to war. 10 years had passed. Odysseus imagined that the final part of his journey might take only a few weeks. The sea had other plans. At first, the ships traveled together. The men watched the coastlines, repaired their sails, and searched for safe places to rest. They had survived the greatest war of their age, and many believed the hardest part of their lives was over. But the world beyond Troy was filled with islands where ordinary rules seemed to loosen. On one shore, Odysseus and his men entered a cave belonging to a one-eyed giant. The giant was a son of Poseidon. Odysseus had faced powerful warriors, but this creature could not be defeated through ordinary battle. The entrance to the cave was blocked by a stone too large for the travelers to move. They were trapped. Odysseus watched. He listened. He allowed the giant to believe that the small group of men posed no lasting danger. Then he formed a plan. He gave the giant a false name, waited until the right moment, and used a sharpened piece of wood to blind the single eye. At dawn, the travelers escaped by hiding beneath the giant's animals as they passed through the entrance. The plan showed the quality Athena valued in Odysseus. He survived through patience and intelligence. Yet success brought pride. Once his ship had moved away from the shore, Odysseus called back across the water and revealed his true name. He wanted the defeated giant to know who had outwitted him. The words crossed the sea. The wounded son called upon Poseidon. He asked his father to prevent Odysseus from reaching home, or at least to make the journey long, lonely, and filled with loss. Poseidon heard. This moment connected the last heroic journey directly to the family we met at the beginning. Poseidon had always valued respect. He could accept the danger of the sea, the struggle between traveler and obstacle, even the defeat of his own son within the harsh rules of the ancient world. But Odysseus had added a proud challenge, sending his name into Poseidon's kingdom as though the sea itself could not answer. The god remembered. Storms began to follow the ships. Winds pushed them away from familiar routes. Islands appeared where no island was expected. Each time home seemed close, another current carried it farther away. Athena cared for Odysseus, but she could not simply erase the will of Poseidon. The gods were powerful, yet they existed within a family of overlapping authority. The sea belonged to Poseidon. Athena could guide the traveler's mind, offer courage, and wait for moments when her influence could reach him, but the journey still had to cross her uncle's realm. Odysseus and his men came to a floating home where the keeper of the winds received them kindly. The dangerous winds were tied inside a sealed bag, while a gentle breeze carried the ships toward home. At last, the hills of the island appeared on the horizon. The exhausted men could almost see the smoke rising from familiar houses. Odysseus fell asleep. His companions looked at the sealed bag and wondered what treasure their king had hidden from them. They opened it. The imprisoned winds escaped at once. The sea darkened. The ships were blown backward, away from the home that had been nearly within reach. This was another repeating pattern in the journey. Odysseus could form a brilliant plan. He could not control every choice made by those around him. A leader might guide a ship, but he could not hold every hand upon the ropes. The fleet wandered onward. On one island, a powerful enchantress transformed the traveler's understanding of what was possible. With guidance and courage, Odysseus resisted her danger, and hostility slowly became hospitality. The men rested there longer than they intended. Time in these distant places did not always feel like time in the mortal world. A season could pass like a quiet afternoon. The wish to return home could soften beneath comfort, food, and the absence of immediate danger. But Odysseus remembered. Again and again, he remembered the rocky island waiting beyond the horizon. The journey was not simply a series of monsters and storms. It was a long test of whether the idea of home could remain strong after years of absence. Poseidon controlled the water beneath the ship. Athena protected the thought that kept the ship moving. And somewhere ahead, beyond every delay, the traveler's own life was waiting for him to return. The road home led Odysseus toward the edge of the living world. To learn how he might complete the journey, he traveled to the boundary of Hades. The underworld he approached was the same ordered kingdom given to Zeus's brother after the War of the Titans. Long ago, Hades had received the shadowed realm by chance. Now one of the last great heroes came seeking knowledge from those who had already completed their mortal paths. Odysseus did not enter as a conqueror. He came quietly. In the darkness, he heard voices from the past. He received the warning he needed and understood more clearly that the journey home would require restraint. He could not challenge every power he met. He could not treat every shore as something to be mastered. To survive Poseidon's sea, intelligence would have to become humility. When Odysseus returned to the upper world, his ship passed an island whose song drew sailors toward danger. The voices promised knowledge, memory, and answers. Odysseus wished to hear them, but he knew that listening freely would destroy him. He ordered his men to block their ears and bind him firmly to the mast. The ship moved forward. The song crossed the water. Odysseus heard everything and could follow none of it. Here, his cleverness was used not to defeat an enemy, but to place a limit upon himself. He understood that wisdom sometimes means arranging protection against one's own future desire. The ship passed safely. Other dangers followed. A narrow channel forced the travelers between threats they could not completely avoid. Sacred animals were harmed despite a clear warning. The consequences left Odysseus alone upon the sea, separated from the companions who had sailed with him from Troy. The great fleet became one broken traveler. He drifted to a distant island where a lonely immortal offered shelter, comfort, and even the possibility of escaping age. For years, Odysseus remained there. The island was beautiful. The shore was quiet. The water shone beneath the sun. There was no war, no command to give, and no immediate storm to survive. Yet Odysseus sat looking toward the sea. Immortality without home did not feel like life to him. Athena saw this. She went before Zeus and asked that the traveler finally be released. Poseidon's anger had lasted for years. Odysseus had lost his ships, his companions, and much of the pride that once made him call his name across the water. Zeus agreed that the journey could continue. The immortal of the island allowed Odysseus to leave. He built a simple vessel and returned to the open sea. Poseidon saw him. One final storm rose. The waves broke the vessel apart, and Odysseus was thrown into the water. For 2 days he struggled between sea and sky, surrounded by the realms of the brothers who had divided the world so long before. Above him was the air of Zeus. Below him was the water of Poseidon. Ahead was the mortal land where Athena's guidance might still reach him. At last, Odysseus found a shore. The people there received him with the hospitality protected by Zeus. They listened to the story of his wandering and offered the one thing he could no longer provide for himself, a safe ship home. Poseidon's sea became calm around this final vessel. Odysseus slept as it traveled. For the first time in years, he did not need to watch the horizon. The sailors carried him across the dark water and placed him gently upon the shore of his own island while he still slept. Beside him, they left the gifts he had received. Then the ship departed. Morning light reached the land. Odysseus opened his eyes. At first, he did not recognize the place. Athena had covered the familiar landscape in mist, protecting him until she could explain what had happened during his absence. When the mist lifted, the traveler touched the earth. The sea had released him. Poseidon's anger had spent its final storm. But reaching the island was not the same as returning to his life. His palace had changed. Strangers had filled its halls. His wife had spent years waiting beneath growing pressure to choose another husband. To recover his home, Odysseus would need Athena's patience one last time. He would have to enter not as a famous king returning from war, but as a quiet stranger whom no one thought worth fearing. Athena stood beside Odysseus on the shore. Throughout his journey, she had often helped from a distance. Now that Poseidon's resistance had eased, she could guide him more openly. She changed his appearance. The king who had once worn armor before the walls of Troy now looked like an old traveler in worn clothing. His face was hidden beneath age and dust. No one who saw him on the road would imagine that the missing ruler had returned. This disguise gave Odysseus time. It allowed him to walk through his own land and learn what years of absence had done. In the palace, a group of men had gathered around his wife. Her name was Penelope. For a long time, she had resisted their demands that she declare Odysseus dead and choose a new husband. She used delay, patience, and clever promises, protecting the household with the same kind of intelligence her husband had used to cross the sea. In this way, the final part of the story was not only about a man trying to return. It was about two people preserving the idea of home from opposite sides of the world. Odysseus had carried home in his memory. Penelope had guarded it in his absence. Their son had grown from an infant into a young man. Athena had begun to guide him as well, giving him courage to search for news of his father and to stand against those who had taken over the palace. The generations were meeting. Athena, daughter of Zeus, now protected the son of Odysseus. The influence of Olympus passed quietly through a mortal family, not as thunder or storm, but as confidence arriving at the necessary moment. Odysseus revealed himself first to those he could trust. He spoke with his son. The meeting held years of absence within a single room. The father saw the child he had left behind now standing as a young man. The son saw that the traveler of old stories was not only a name from the war, but a tired person who had finally reached home. Together, they prepared to reclaim the palace. The contest that followed centered upon the old bow of Odysseus. Penelope announced that she would consider the man able to string it and complete a difficult shot. One by one, those who had occupied the palace tried and failed. Then the unknown traveler asked to hold the bow. The room watched. His hands remembered its weight. The string drew back. In that moment, the disguise no longer mattered. Odysseus had returned. The conflict inside the palace was brief compared with the 10-year war and the 10-year voyage that came before it. Athena remained near, preventing the final struggle from growing beyond the restoration of the household. Yet one question still remained. Would Penelope believe him? Many years had passed. Stories of gods and disguises filled the world. A stranger could claim a famous name. Penelope did not accept the answer simply because others did. She tested him with a private detail about their marriage bed, built long ago around the living trunk of an olive tree. It could not be moved without cutting it from the roots. Odysseus reacted at once. Only the true builder of the bed would know its secret. At last, Penelope understood. The long separation ended not through a display of strength, but through shared memory. The hero of Troy, the planner of the wooden horse and the traveler who escaped giants and storms was recognized by something quiet, knowledge of the home he had built with the person waiting inside it. This was Athena's kind of ending. Thought before force. Patience before pride. Recognition earned through understanding. Odysseus had left as a king seeking war and fame. He returned as someone who knew the value of an ordinary room, a rooted tree, and the presence of family. Poseidon had made the road long. Athena had helped him continue. Zeus had allowed the balance to shift toward return. Hades had shown him the voices of the past. The family that ruled the world had touched every stage of his journey. But the final choice belonged to a mortal. Odysseus chose home. With his return, the great age of heroes began to grow quiet. Hercules had completed his labors. Achilles and Hector rested far from the battles that made their names eternal. Troy had fallen. The ships had scattered. And the last famous traveler had finally crossed his own threshold. Night settles once more over Olympus. The long stories of gods and heroes grow quiet beneath the stars. Zeus remains above the clouds, watching the distant lights of the mortal world. He is still the ruler who freed his brothers and sisters. He is also the father whose choices filled the later generations with both possibility and conflict. Beside him is Hera. She remains queen, guardian of marriage and dignity, shaped by loyalty, wounded by its absence and capable, at last, of allowing some old anger to end. Far below, the sea moves through Poseidon's kingdom. Waves reach the shores of Troy, the islands crossed by Odysseus, and every harbor where a sailor pauses before beginning a journey. Poseidon's anger could make a voyage last for years, but even the sea eventually releases what it carries. Beneath the earth, Hades keeps the oldest boundary. Persephone sits beside him for part of every year. When she returns to the world above, Demeter welcomes her and the fields awaken. When she descends again, the earth rests. Athena moves between the palace of Zeus and the cities of mortals. She remains the quiet thought before action, the plan formed while others see only danger, the guide who does not complete the road for a traveler but helps the traveler recognize the next step. Hercules is remembered not only for strength, but for endurance. Achilles is remembered not only for victory, but for the moment he recognized a grieving father in an enemy king. Odysseus is remembered not only for cleverness, but for the wish that survived every island and storm, the wish to return home. These figures seem to belong to different stories. A war among the Titans. A queen beneath the earth. A hero carrying the sky. A warrior outside the walls of Troy. A traveler bound to the mast of a ship. Yet their paths return again and again to the same family. Cronus feared that his children would change the world. He was right. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, and Hestia ended the age of their father and built a new order from its ruins. But they did not create a perfect world. They created a living one. A world where love could alter the seasons. Where pride could disturb the sea. Where a broken promise could survive for generations. Where children inherited the unfinished struggles of their parents, yet still had the possibility of choosing a different ending. This is why the myths remained alive. The gods were greater than mortals, but their family was filled with feelings that mortals understood. Fear of losing power. The need for respect. Jealousy within a marriage. Grief for a child. Anger after an insult. The desire to be remembered. The longing to come home. The scale was divine, but the heart of the story was familiar. And perhaps that is why the ancient Greeks did not imagine their gods as distant and perfect. They imagined them as a family. A family powerful enough to divide the sky, sea, and underworld. A family whose arguments could become storms and whose agreements could become seasons. A family whose children and favorites walked among heroes. A family that ruled the world, but could never completely rule itself. Now the halls of Olympus have grown still. The central fire burns softly. Beyond the terraces, the clouds drift through the darkness, passing beneath the stars. The sea continues its slow movement against distant shores. Deep beneath the fields, seeds wait quietly for their season. And in an old palace on a rocky island, a traveler rests at last beneath his own roof. The stories do not need to continue tonight. The thunder is far away. The ships are safely drawn onto the shore. The gates of the city are closed, and the lamps within the houses have begun to fade. You have traveled from Olympus into the age of the Titans, across the divided realms of the gods, through the fields of Demeter, along the labors of Hercules, beneath the walls of Troy and over the long dark sea. Now the journey can become quiet. There is no new name to remember. No further road to follow. Only the soft movement of the world the old stories left behind. Sky above. Earth below. Sea beyond the shore. And the calm darkness of night resting gently over them all.